Good morning. So in the next hour, I'm going to help you understand fast healthcare interoperability resources, FHIR, which is a data standard, healthcare data standard based on 21st century technology to solve 21st century data interoperability problems. FHIR is an open source standard. It was created to solve the problem that there is data in an increasing number of systems in healthcare and health that we need to access. And FHIR was created as a way to access it without having to know how the data is stored in those systems, because we can't keep up with that. So as Mike said, I'm a senior clinical advisor for interoperability. I've been with InterSystems about 7 years. I am passionate about FHIR because I think it is going to change the way we can interoperate between different systems and improve the health of individuals. It was created, as I say, to solve that problem of accessing data in different systems. So I'm going to talk first about how we develop FHIR, how the HL7 standards organization develops FHIR, how it's being produced and how it's different from other standards. And then I'm going to give you a conceptual view of FHIR without being too technical, no more technical than you need to be to understand the internet. I'm going to finish up talking a little bit about the new interoperability and where FHIR is going. So FHIR was actually proposed out of Australia, but the call to action that led to the development of FHIR came from a U.S. Institute of Medicine report in 2001. That report, Crossing the Quality Chasm, followed another report earlier by that organization, To Err is Human, that had pointed out that in the U.S., there were some 100,000 deaths per year due to medical errors. And they weren't oops errors. They were the kind of errors that we refer to as system errors. As somebody said yesterday, it was about not having the right information at the right place at the right time. So the Health Level 7 organization, which has existed for about 35 years, is an ANSI-accredited standards development organization. There are hundreds of volunteers who are involved in HL7 activity, and they come from all across healthcare organizations, IT vendors, government agencies. There are 40 working groups that have elected co-chairs. And part of the governance of HL7 is that every standard that HL7 publishes goes through a consensus balloting process, and that includes FHIR. That means that a work group develops a standard and then it is put up for ballot by anyone that's interested in voting on that standard. And all no votes that are accompanied by a comment about what the voter thinks is wrong have to be resolved before the standard is published. So it's a very rigorous process, and that's the process that FHIR goes through as each new release is published. There are HL7 affiliates in 40 different countries, including the UK, and those affiliates work on localization of HL7 standards. HL7 has three 5-day working group meetings each year, and the key there is they're working group meetings. They're not conferences, educational conferences. It's where the work actually gets done on producing standards. And in addition to that, there are about over 100 conference calls every week between these work groups working on the development of standards. A large proportion of those now are about FHIR. All HL7 standards, including FHIR, are open source standards. And InterSystems, I'm proud to say, has been a benefactor member of the HL7 organization for over 20 years now. I'm very involved in the work that HL7 does. So FHIR is different, and I wanted to say a bit about that. It's different as a standard. It's certainly a different technology. It's developed under a process that is like modern software development, which is not the process that's been used for developing legacy standards that HL7 has produced. Very importantly, and I'll repeat this a few times, everything about the FHIR standard, the FHIR specification, is on the HL7 FHIR website as machine-readable content. You can download it to your server, your laptop, and you can have a functioning version of that release of FHIR within a few hours. And everything is also human-readable that's on that FHIR website, so you can understand the FHIR standard as a human. And all the published versions of FHIR, we're now on the fourth release of FHIR. All the published versions are there on the website, as is what is called the current build. That is the next version of FHIR that's there for developers to use and test, and that's part of the process of developing the FHIR standard, is it actually gets tested during the process of developing it. And all of that is there on the HL7 website. Anyone can enter a change request, a comment on a page of that next version, and that comment gets addressed by the work group that's responsible for that particular portion of FHIR, and that comment may lead to changes in FHIR which get implemented into that next version of FHIR within a day. So that's a very important difference in the way that FHIR is being developed. Standards, legacy standards were developed as documents, as PDFs that really weren't usable until they were finished, a matter of months or a year or more. And then those documents had to be interpreted by developers, by implementers, and implemented in different systems, which produces a much more inconsistent problem than this idea that FHIR can be downloaded as machine-readable code and implemented into your system. So another important aspect of HL7 developing FHIR is these are the same people that brought you the previous HL7 standards, and HL7 has published over 300 standards. So there is a lot of organizational knowledge, a lot of lessons learned that go into the development of the FHIR standard. And once again, it's all downloadable in machine-readable format to be used for development of different systems and software. FHIR also gets tested in connectathons 3 times each year, where hundreds of individuals come together to test various aspects of FHIR, which leads to changes and improvement in FHIR before it actually gets published and implemented in different systems. I also want to talk about the global community that has evolved quite astonishingly to support the development and implementation of FHIR. Now, this is beyond the HL7 organization. FHIR is supported by an incredible collaborative open source community, and these members of this community span virtually all countries. It's a very global community. There is a chat platform for FHIR at chat.phir.org that has over 25,000 logins and hundreds of messages each day in over 100 streams with people asking questions, developers, about something they're trying to do with FHIR, and they get answers from other experts on the FHIR standard. This is remarkably different from the way previous standards have been implemented in healthcare. And it's one reason that FHIR is such a phenomenal growth for healthcare. It is an innovation in healthcare. It has been referred to by many as the leading innovation in healthcare technology of the last decade. It's the kind of innovation that Chris Norton referred to yesterday with the pendulum light bulbs, where it's an innovation that inspires and enables additional innovations and another innovation round on top of that. That's the effect that FHIR has been having on healthcare interoperability since it first appeared. And the implementation guides for FHIR are published at registry.phir.org, so they can be downloaded and used for implementation. So next, I want to talk about the concept of FHIR. And as I said, I'm not going to be any more technical than you need to be to use the internet every day. And I'm going to start out by going back to when interoperability in healthcare really began. And that was in the 1980s. And the reason was that hospitals started to have more than one system within the hospital. They had an administrative system, a lab system, a pharmacy system, and they had to connect those systems. It wasn't about exchanging data with other hospitals. It wasn't about people being able to access that data in the systems. It was just about connecting the systems. And if we fast forward to the current time, it was said a few years ago that the average hospital has over 80 systems within its walls. And when hospitals are acquired and combined, you have multiples of 80 systems, and they are still being connected with those same standards that were developed to connect two systems together. It's remarkable how far that has gone. The HL7 version 2 standard is the most used data standard in the world, connecting all those systems. It's not going to go away. We're going to live in a hybrid world because there's no economic argument for replacing all those systems. They will still exist, and HL7 version 2 will still exist. I think it will survive the apocalypse, but it will be around for way into the foreseeable future. So not only are there more systems in the hospital now, but as we know, there's data in a lot more places in healthcare and in health. Pharmacies have data, payer systems have data, patients have data in their mobile devices, clinicians have data in their mobile devices, genomic sequencing labs have data. There is data in an increasing number of places. And interoperability, which once meant connecting two systems together, interoperability now means being able to be in one place and see all that data for a patient or for a population of patients from that one place. That's the new meaning of interoperability. That's what FHIR was developed to solve the problem. So not only is there data in more places, but there is a lot more data. And Dr. William Stead at Vanderbilt a few years ago published a paper estimating the amount of data that exists for every complex decision in healthcare. And he estimates that in 1980, there were about 10 facts per complex decision. And in 2020, 1,000 facts per complex decision. So it's increasing exponentially. And I would say that not all decisions in healthcare are complex, but most decisions in healthcare are becoming more complex, partly because of the amount of data that has to be considered. Now, what hasn't changed in those 4 decades is the number of facts that a human mind can handle in making a decision. And on average, it's about 5. And I suspect most of you in this room, like me, can probably handle 8 or 9. But we were behind in 1980, and now we're hopelessly behind like everyone else. The only solution to this problem is to make those facts computable so that computers can help us in making those decisions. So it was that developing reality that led the HL7 organization to form a task force about a decade ago and ask that task force, what if we created a new data standard? What would it look like? HL7 version 2 was not able to connect across systems. HL7 version 3 had been so complex that there was not much uptake. It never was implemented. And the CDA standard, the document standard, was not created to exchange data. It was created to make documents electronic and usable by clinicians. So a gentleman in Australia, Graham Grieve, came forth with a proposal that is what we now call FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. It was to address the problem of data moving from offline in basements like Jeff Fried's basement, as he mentioned, in basements of the hospitals, to online and in the cloud, data transparency in many jurisdictions around the world, and data increasingly becoming a mixture of narrative and coded data in healthcare. So FHIR in its essence is what's called a REST API, a representational transfer state API. And you may know what an API is, but to explain it simply, I would use the analogy of a travel website. So if you go to your favorite travel website and say you want to go from London to New York on November the 15th, within a few seconds you see a list of flights from different airlines. That's not because the travel website has downloaded all the airline schedules. It's because the airlines have agreed on how to represent the data in an airline flight, how a system can ask for that and what it gets back in return. That's a REST API, and that's what FHIR is for healthcare. It's the same technology, but it's the meaning of the data in healthcare. And that's where it gets very complicated because, as you know, the meaning of data in healthcare is complex. There is a lot of data, and it involves humans. So it is incredibly complex compared to most other businesses, probably all other businesses. So there are a few concepts to understand FHIR. And I'm going to talk about those for the next few minutes. The first of those is resources. And that's resources as in URL. Remember, that stands for Uniform Resource Locator. So FHIR resources are logically discrete data concepts in healthcare, like a patient, a medication, a care plan, a family history. Some of them are infrastructure things like lists. So no matter whether it's a list of a patient's medications or a list of patients that a provider has in the hospital, it uses the same FHIR resource. So those resources in FHIR have a meaning that is the FHIR specification. They have a location which looks like a URL or URI that points to where that resource is located on a server, and it may be the server that in your organization, or it may be a server on the internet, but that's where that resource, that piece of data is located. And those resources in FHIR inside contain all the data elements needed to describe whatever data concept that is. So say it's a patient, it's a given name, family name, date of birth, gender, and so forth, everything you need to describe a patient, or everything you need to describe some other data concept in healthcare. Resources are connected to each other. They point to another resource, which is something that's totally different from other data concepts in healthcare. Those resources point to another resource on the server that they're on. So they, for example, a medication resource would point to a Joe's patient resource saying, I am Joe's medication, or I am Joe's condition for the condition resource, or I am Joe's care plan for the care plan resource. That's how they're connected. That data is connected on the computer, very different from what we're accustomed to, but it makes it possible to query for that data for small pieces of that data, which is one way that FHIR is very different, or actually two ways that FHIR is very different. One way is that you can query for data, which you can't do with other healthcare data standards, and you can query for just the data you want. You don't get all of the data on Joe. You get only his medications, if that's what you want or need, because usually in healthcare, we do only need to know one thing. Whether we're the patient, we don't want to know everything about our data. We want to know some specific piece, or a clinician wants to know something specific about us, not everything at any given moment in taking care of a patient. The second and very important concept to understand in FHIR is FHIR profiles. So FHIR profiles are the description of what you need for a particular use case. They're all of the FHIR data elements that you need for that use case, for that FHIR resource. They are the value sets that you need for that use case. They are the FHIR extensions that you need, and I'm going to come back in a minute and talk about what a value set and a FHIR extension is. And they are the profile is the set of rules that you need for that particular use case. That's one of the important pieces of interoperability in FHIR. And very importantly, interoperability is based not on using FHIR, but on using the same FHIR profile for a particular use case. So FHIR is by design flexible so that you can use it for different use cases, but flexibility is the opposite of interoperability. So to create interoperability, we have to have these FHIR profiles that specify exactly what the rules are for the data in a particular use case. Now, once you have created that FHIR profile, for that piece of data, it becomes usable in different interoperability paradigms, something we can't say about other data standards. So if you have, for example, created a profile for a laboratory test, then you can take that laboratory test result from a FHIR API, and you can put that data according to that FHIR profile into a document. You can put that same data into a message like an HL7 version 2 message and send it to another system. Or you can use that data in a decision support service because it is computable as it is based on that FHIR profile. So you can use the data in all of these different interoperability paradigms without having to transform it or do anything to it. That is one of the things that is profoundly different about the FHIR standard and data that is represented with it. So it is said that true interoperability is when we exchange data and we mean the same thing. So that is often referred to as semantic interoperability. But it's not really we as humans that have to mean the same thing. It's the computer systems that have to mean the same thing. So let me give you a simple analogy for that. If two people had never seen this animal before, and one of them says, it's a white horse with black stripes, and the other one says, it's a black horse with white stripes. Well, even if it was two children, they would figure out pretty quickly they were talking about the same thing. But to a computer system, those are absolutely two different things. They are not the same thing, and those two descriptions are not interoperable. So it's true we could program the computer system to understand that, but the problem is there are hundreds of thousands of zebras in healthcare, and we can't program computers to understand all of those different meanings of all of those different concepts. So we have to have, for each of those data concepts, what is called a clinical information model, a detailed model that is all the rules for the data that we're representing, all the relationships between the data elements in that, and all the vocabulary binding, the terminology or codes that we're going to allow for that particular use case or information model. So that's starting to sound like a FHIR profile, and in fact, that's exactly what a FHIR profile is. It's an implementation of one of these detailed clinical information models. So have we had models before? Well, yes, there have been modelers for a long time, but we have used a model without thinking about it, and that's clinical documents. So suppose, as an example, we printed out a history and physical on an individual, and we took a pair of scissors and we cut that into data elements. Then we might pick up a piece of paper and there's a data element on it, and we know what that is. Say it says diabetes, but what we don't know is that a condition the patient has currently? Is it a condition the patient had before they had weight loss surgery and lost 200 pounds? Or is it a condition that their mother had and it was in the family history? So those are the relationships between the data that we need to understand for understanding that data. And we understand it commonly in healthcare today because it's part of a document and we know where it is in that document. But FHIR has to solve that problem of being able to capture the relationship between the data that we have in a system about an individual patient. Part of that is, as I explained, that idea of FHIR resources pointing to each other. I am Joe's medication. So as an example of how profiles are used, let me take a particular use case and say it's a procedure, and it could be a diagnostic procedure like a laboratory test. It could be an imaging procedure. It could be a surgical procedure. All procedures have certain things in common. So what you can't see from this 30,000-foot view of this procedure, that each of the FHIR resources that are part of this procedure have details in them that are the FHIR profile for this, for that resource for this procedure. So there is a procedure resource that is what kind of procedure it is. There is a patient upon whom the procedure is performed, the patient resource. There is a a practitioner who is it's the FHIR resource that represents who performed the procedure. There is, for most procedures, a diagnostic report, the results of the procedure. That's the diagnostic report resource in FHIR. And for most procedures, they occur in the setting of an encounter. So there's a FHIR encounter resource that tells you the details. All of those resources would be profiled and would make up the use case for a procedure, whatever procedure it happens to be. Now, I said I was going to talk a bit about value sets and terminology because an important part of the FHIR specification is the concept of a terminology server, a FHIR terminology server. So it might be the same server you're using, but it could be another server somewhere connected on the internet. But on those terminology servers are the value sets that you need for your particular application or implementation of FHIR and the code systems that contain those value sets. So SNOMED, LOINC, other code systems you would have on your server. The value sets would be specified and would be accessible on that server with something that looks like a URL once again, and that would be the way your application accesses those value sets for whatever use that application is. And as an example, let's say we had an application that was to help a clinician choose an antibiotic for treating bacterial pneumonia. Well, you would have a value set of the 37 antibiotics, or how many there are, that you might use to treat pneumonia. You would have the code system to represent those antibiotics in, and that list of antibiotics and the codes for them would be stored on the FHIR terminology server so that your application and any other application that is using the same information that is for treating bacterial pneumonia could access that value set without having to download all the value sets to your system. So if the value set gets updated, you don't have to worry about that. It's there on that terminology server for your application to use. So there are many needed value sets, some of which are part of the FHIR standard and some of which you would develop for a particular application. All of them accessible on a FHIR terminology server. And all of them part of creating these clinical information models for whatever use case you're dealing with. And I said I was going to talk about FHIR extensions. FHIR extensions are to capture data that isn't part of the FHIR standard. So it was a deliberate design principle of the FHIR standard that it would include only data elements that were already present in 80% of systems. This was to make the FHIR standard more easily usable so that it could be implemented more easily, but it was understood that many use cases would have some data element that was not part of the FHIR standard. So the FHIR extension is a formal way of representing those other data elements. And part of the FHIR requirement is that if you create an extension for something, you must publish the definition of that extension, what it means, to a publicly accessible URL, so that anybody else that gets data that contains that extension is able to discover what it means. So as a simple example of that, not a clinical example, but something that might happen in healthcare, suppose you're part of a facility that does medical tourism and you see patients from different countries in your facility. You want to know what the patient's nationality is. Well, nationality is not part of the patient resource. As I said, it's name and birth date and so forth, but it doesn't include nationality. So you create a FHIR extension for nationality to extend the patient resource. All extensions extend some resource, and you publish that meaning of that extension to a public server so that anybody that is exchanging data with you can know that that is the nationality for the patient that you're seeing at your facility. And it works the same even for clinical data concepts, for extensions for those data elements. So that brings us to the end game for FHIR, which is the FHIR Implementation Guide. And the FHIR Implementation Guide is actually a FHIR resource, but it's a formal description of how you create an implementation guide for a particular use case in FHIR. It includes, the implementation guide includes all of the FHIR profiles that you need for that use case, all of the extensions you need, all of the value sets you need, and the rules and relationships for the data in that particular implementation guide. And it is, the HL7 has a web publishing tool so that you can publish your implementation guide to a URL, and then anybody can access that implementation guide, download it, and implement it in their system or for their application. So once again, the content of that implementation guide is machine readable. The implementation guide also has human readable examples of what you would use this implementation guide for. But the fact that there is machine readable content there means that when you use that implementation guide and create an application, it can be validated for compliance with those FHIR profiles and value sets to assure that it's going to be interoperable with other applications using that implementation guide. So as an example, there might be an implementation guide, there is an implementation guide for case reporting for COVID, e-case reports that is published. There is a FHIR website, registry.phir.org, where implementation guides are published. Some of those are implementation guides for specific jurisdictions like the UK that include the requirements, government requirements around FHIR for that jurisdiction. Many of them are use case specific, but they can be downloaded and implemented from that website. So that is the overview of the FHIR standard and how it works conceptually. It's obviously more complex to actually implement things with it, but its uptake has been very remarkable globally. It is being used in many different systems, and it continues to grow. We are currently using in the most recent FHIR release is FHIR Release 4. FHIR Release 5 is about to be balloted and will be published the first part of next year. And that is the progression of the FHIR standard with new features and functions in each successive release. I'm not going to talk about our products specifically, but InterSystems has a commitment to being on the leading edge of FHIR. You've heard it mentioned in a number of other presentations the last 2 days. We have one FHIR stack in all of our products, consistently across our products, built on our technology. It, like our other products and capability, is scalable vertically and horizontally. And the other important thing about our technology and our capability is that we are going to live in a hybrid environment for the foreseeable future, not only with the advancing an increasing use of FHIR, but with the continued use of HL7 version 2 and many other healthcare data standards. And InterSystems has the ability to create that hybrid environment for your system or your organization where all of these different data streams and different standards can be brought together, can be transformed into FHIR or out of FHIR, and to enable increasing interoperability across different systems. So let me talk a little bit about what's coming next with FHIR, not in great detail, but just the idea of where we're going. You may have heard a little bit in some of the talks about analytics with FHIR and about bulk FHIR, which is the idea of having a large data set that is a population level data set of data represented as FHIR. It turns out that using a FHIR API, a REST API, is not an efficient way to access or move large quantities, population level quantities of data. So there is a concept of bulk FHIR, of large data sets of FHIR that use a different type of technology to represent that data. That is something that is just reaching maturity in the FHIR standard itself and is just starting to be piloted and implemented in different systems, and will be an increasingly important part of FHIR data exchange in the future going forward. We will certainly have that capability as well with FHIR bulk data in our Iris for Health FHIR data repository. You heard earlier this morning about the FHIR SQL Builder, which is a way without needing to have bulk data to do analytics, SQL analytics on large repositories of data. What I didn't hear mentioned this morning is that requires that the data be in our FHIR repository to take advantage of the capability of the FHIR SQL Builder. There are many areas where FHIR is advancing, where it has not been used much in the past. One of those is in life science, in clinical and translational research. InterSystems is a member of a project in HL7 called Vulcan, that is an externally funded project funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, several academic medical centers, several pharmaceutical companies, to develop the capability to do clinical research, pharmaceutical trials, leveraging FHIR as the interoperability for those life science use cases. There is an increasing use of FHIR for genomics data exchange that is advancing very rapidly, but is still in an early stage. Devices on FHIR is something else that is just starting to be developed and advanced, using FHIR for connecting devices to other systems and for connecting to devices. FHIR is inherently the technology of many devices in use today. The technology of the Internet of Things is the same technology FHIR is built on. And an increasing use of FHIR in care management, particularly care management that's taking place outside the hospital and outside traditional facilities in the community and in the home. And you heard perhaps yesterday about the use of FHIR in our care community product that's part of the HealthShare a suite of products. So with that, I will ask this question as to close, and that question is, why wasn't the iPhone 14 released in 2017 as the first iPhone? Well, the answer obviously is the iPhone has evolved, and the iPhone 14 is the product of 15 years of innovation and evolution of the iPhone. And I think I hear people say, well, didn't we already try FHIR and it didn't work? Or, well, FHIR's not very mature. I'm not sure it's time to try it. I would say that we need to change our concept of standards maturity and apply that to FHIR. Call it the iPhone maturity model. But FHIR is like smartphones. In its first release, was not very sophisticated, didn't do many things, you might say, but it did things you couldn't do before. And like smartphones, with each new model, each new release of FHIR is bringing more capability and more functionality and more opportunity for this innovation on the innovation that FHIR represents. And the next release of FHIR will have more capability and more function. And some of that will come from the use of the current version of FHIR. FHIR will advance the way smartphones advance, and we will find new ways to innovate with it and new capabilities to include in it in future releases. So that's my concept of FHIR, and I'm ready to take questions now for